I'd like to welcome you to the Cherry Webb Gallery and our collection of WPA paintings. In an effort to kind of bring you into the time of 1936, I've prepared some written information just so I don't forget to say it. But what I'd like to do also is really look at the paintings so that you can understand the different styles, the different painters that participated in the WPA, and really enjoy this collection, which came to the Art Association kind of under mysterious circumstances. The paintings were found in a warehouse. This is the story anyway, the mythology of the WPA paintings that the Art Association came upon. They were found in a warehouse somewhere in Boston. I believe it was part of the Boston Art Club. I don't know that to be fact, but I presume that's, where they were. And they were scheduled to be destroyed. And I guess one of the artists realized that they were valuable, not only, I guess, in terms of 1936 paintings, WPA, but as a comprehensive collection of different artist styles, and all in the same time period and all government sponsored. Yes?
My son is Chris Bartley, and he was the gentleman that initiated saving the WPAs because they were going to get destroyed, and we, along with myself and him and someone else, I forget who it was, we rented a truck and we went up to the Boston area to find out where they were, and we brought them home.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. So thank you for sharing. Now the truth is coming out. So where did you pick them up?
I can't remember, it was that long ago, but it was in an area where it's like someone lended out the artwork from the Art Association, and they never returned them. They just kept on traveling. And we found them in some school up in the Boston area.
That's marvelous. And I know they were restored, I think in 2009.
Yes, and we had them restored.
They were, somewhat restored. The canvases are very brittle. And I think it would cost, literally thousands upon thousands of dollars to actually restore them correctly. But they have been framed. And
we had them cleaned, not restored.
You had them cleaned.
And we're working with
Riverside Art, wasn't it?
Riverside Art,
yeah.
And they framed them for us.
Yeah. So because they weren't framed, it was impossible to showcase them. But as you can see, they all have these nice gold frames now, and they're looking, pretty nice, particularly in this beautiful public space. So thank you. If you have anything to add, please feel free to do so. But I'm going to read a little bit what I did some research just so that I don't forget to give you the backstory. The Great Depression of the 1930s was the catalyst for the government relief programs that supported the arts and created thousands of public works throughout the United States. During these troubling times, there were few jobs, and entire families were left without a source of income or support. It was especially hard on artists whose work were no longer considered necessary, but an extravagance in a time of deep and prolonged poverty and hardship. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, under presidential executive order, who brought the WPA programs into being under the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act of April 1935. From 1935 to 1943, WPA workers received a stipend from the United States government, and as a result created public art projects and American art. And I think that's important to understand, that it is truly American art. We're so used to celebrating European art or other countries, but this is truly the American statement. And it has become indeed our American legacy, art legacy. In addition to tangible public works such as roads, bridges, highways, landing fields, parks, hospitals, and libraries, these remain a reminder of the enormous scope of the program, the WPA program. Now, there was a precursor to the WPA program, and that was called Works in Progress Administration, or PWAP, Public Works of Art Project. That began in December of 1933. That lasted only 6 months, and it was responsible for creating over 1,500 works of public art, of which 700 murals were painted in public buildings. That is probably the program under which John Mann painted those murals that you saw earlier today. It's not the WPA. This program that I'm speaking of right now was in fact juried. So John Mann had to conceive of his history that he painted and present it to a committee who subsequently approved it, unlike these paintings, which were much different in scope. Okay, so there were 2 different programs, and the one that the murals were painted under was a separate juried process, and they were paid pretty handsomely compared to the WPA artists. Let's see, the suggested theme, and as you saw earlier today when you visited those murals, was the American scene. That was the suggested theme, in order to give visual consistency and based on 1920s work of Edward Hopper, Thomas Hart Benton, Grant Woods, and others, and I'm sure you recognize the names of some of those artists. Many of them have gained national recognition. Subsequent retrospective exhibitions were mounted at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C., and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, to very favorable reviews. A quote from Holger Cahill of MoMA, and he subsequently became the national director of the WPA. He had this to say: "American artists have discovered that they have work to do in the world. Awareness of society's need and desire for what they can produce has given them a new sense of continuity and assurance. His awareness has served to enhance the already apparent trend towards social content in art." So we're going to see a little bit of that as we go along. Uncle Sam, under the New Deal, continued as patron to the arts through the redefined WPA program, which had branches supporting lots of different art. It wasn't just painting. There were programs that supported theater, music, writing, and historical documentation. I like that one. I don't really know much about that, but I do know about the writing and the music, in addition to the painting. The collection offered here was donated, and I don't know your first name, is it Chris?
James.
James. James explained that he was actually the person who drove the van to get the paintings.
Yeah, I drove the van, but yeah, together we were doing this together.
I think I didn't know that part, and it's really nice to hear that. They were donated and picked up, and as you've been told, Riverside Art did cleaning and framed them. So after that was done, I believe in 2009, they've been shown in a variety of locations. But I'm especially happy to bring them to a downtown location where everyone can see them. You can go to the courthouse and come over, you can have a cup of coffee, you can be strolling downtown, whatever it be, and come in and visit these wonderful paintings. So let's see, what else do I have to say? So it wasn't just painting, it was the arts in general. And it ran for 8 years, 1935 to 43. They are still owned by the United States government. So we don't own them, we are custodians of the paintings, and we can't sell them. Wouldn't want to. So I think they really have become, like the murals, a legacy of, you know, history, of American history, which I think sometimes gets overlooked when we're studying art history. So about the paintings themselves, I always feel an informative approach to looking at this collection is to study the painting of the same artist and do a comparative against perhaps some other work that is here. And that is how I came to truly appreciate the stylistic differences, the concepts, and the content of this collection. Firstly, they are diverse in accomplishment, and I'm sure you'll be able to see that. Some are much more refined than others and much more informed than others. But that's the beauty of it. You know, you get to see all kinds of skill levels. There are outdoor scenes of all 4 seasons, countryside houses, still life studies, a lot of still lifes. There is definite social realism in the first 2 that I'm going to ask you to look at, and that was the prevailing style of the time. You know, that realism, and particularly social realism in a positive way. That's what the United States government wanted to promote during the Depression. It wasn't the end of the world, but in fact the beginning of something new. So social realism in a positive way was the prevailing style. But there is also what anyone who goes to art school will relate to. You had the traditional still life. And there are many examples of the traditional still life which helps a painter, I'm sure we have a few artists in the group, but helps a painter understand perceptive issues, color comparatives, spatial composition, and learning how to paint. And if you have, for instance, a still life set up, how to duplicate that color with, and transparency with paint. So they're really academic studies to a large degree when you're looking at still life painting. And I'm not a painter per se, but having been in art school for many years, I had to do the same kind of work. So they're really fun, and they're you know, in great variety and skill level. It is probable that this collection came from one Boston-based WPA art studio. I don't know the answer to that. But anyway, here it is. So with that being said, and if you have any questions at this point, and again, I'm not an art historian, I'm just the kind of the protector of this collection at this point in time. Others have come before me. But while you're all sitting there, I would like to point out these 2, which I think are really the most important examples, not necessarily the best work, but the most important examples of social realism during WPA, okay, and what the government was really interested in getting the artists to paint. This is Waldo Murray, Boston-based artist, and from my perspective, his paintings are notable examples of the WPA era, which is to elevate the working man. So here we have a scene, and you notice this is signed 1936, Waldo Murray. And what is he doing here? The name of the painting, The Old Acorn Press. So we have a man working at something that at this point in time is an antique process. You wouldn't see that now, so it becomes a historical documentation of 1936, social realism of the working man. Stylistically, I would say it's certainly realistic, yes. Subdued color, quiet space, composition is very nice, limited palette, almost monochromatic, right?
Sheila?
Yes.
When we first had our hands on them, we looked at all of them, and some of them we tried to figure out where they were painted. You know what I mean? Like that house or that building, or what city where they were painted. Some of them, I just couldn't find out about all that information. I don't know how you...
It's a little easier on the internet now.
Yeah.
But what I read about WPA artists in particular, they painted in groups. So I would suspect that, you know, many of these, particularly the landscapes, they probably went plein air, or, you know, maybe not quite plein air, but certainly it has to be Boston, because when we look at George Constantine's work, there's 3 consecutively that are the Boston area. So I suspect it's the Boston Art Club. That's my feeling, but I can't be definite about that. But anyway, getting back to Waldo, obviously he's in a workspace, and I don't know where this is, except I assume it's Boston. And let's just look at this one here. Because I think, if you don't mind kind of getting up and taking a real look-see, I think this one is a much more, it's the same artist. You've got Waldo Murray, and it is, again, the printing press. But this gives you a different perspective, where you have kind of a man, and it is the same man. If you look at the body build of the man in the painting to the left, you're going to see a similarity in body build. But the perspective in this case is much, much different.
That's an artist.
Yes, I'm so glad you saw that. So this could be even a self-portrait. I don't know. But this is obviously a palette that the man is holding. And it looks like, if you compare the window, it's the same. So you're looking at two different perspectives. It's kind of interesting because today in photography, you would take a shot and then maybe you would zoom in and take another shot, and that's how this has been translated visually.
It looks like, again, another type of printing press.
I don't know the answer. It doesn't say acorn, it says printing and etching.
Printing.
Yeah, so I don't know, but I did have the opportunity, and I don't know if I brought it with me. This artist studied under Sargent, so who was a famous, John Singer Sargent, who was a famous portrait painter, American-born, but worked mainly in England. And Waldo was one of his students. And in this particular painting, you can see he's a very accomplished portrait painter, you know, which he was. I went online and I was lucky enough to find other examples of his work. And he's this is a young Waldo at this point. Later on in his career, he was a very accomplished portrait painter. So I love these two because I feel they're a good juxtaposition in learning and enjoying the WPA. But not only that, looking at the maturity and the style of a real portrait painter. And he did work there. They're on the back. They say the WPA, you know, WPA 1936. On the back, I guess one of the requirements was to actually paint the letters WPA and the year that they were painted on the back of the canvases to authenticate them. So I love these two for that reason. It gives you that wonderful perspective and enjoyment of one space, one artist, and a different, but I love this one anyway. I just love the palette. I think it's a great painting. So that's Waldo. Let's see what else I found out about him. Similar atmospheric light. So his palette is pretty consistent. It's not bright. It's a very subdued palette.
Greens and browns.
Well, I would call them neutrals. And he does have, I don't know who this woman is, but beautifully articulated.
And the clothing definitely of the period.
Yes. Here's an example of another one of his paintings that only sold for $100.
I think I like that one better.
Yeah, I do too.
This one, it could be anybody.
Yeah, it could be anybody. Well, that's what he did. He was a portrait painter, basically. Yes?
I'm noticing that the lady has on trousers, very fancy trousers.
I like that
but
face better.
was that
Yeah,
something
and
unusual then?
I don't know, but I do know that people were much smaller, and I believe that the men's trousers were kind of with the cuff, wide-legged. I don't know.
I have a picture of my own grandmother at that time
Wearing a period dress.
just regular dresses.
Yeah.
And, or, because he was not of that era.
Yeah, well, again, this is not photography, it's painting. So I think that everything is planned, including the, you know, what the men wore and for palette purposes. Okay.
Without her, it would be not nearly as good.
Okay, we're ready to move on to one other example that you might find really interesting. And let's move over to tragedy. Yes, tragedy.
Are you from Fall River Art Association?
I am, yeah, yeah. So here we are looking at tragedy. I'm going to sneak in here, and don't get that camera too close. And we have what I would call some kind of allegory. I'm not sure exactly, but I will tell you I did some research on the artist, Jacob Rosenberg, and let me be sure. Jacob Rosenberg, 1936, and the title is Tragedy. And I guess this would be social realism, but not celebrating the working man. It looks more allegorical to me. And when I did research on him, I found that he was a very interesting man. He was born in Germany, and he actually served in World War I. He fought for the German army in World War I. If anybody's interested in looking at that. He was a POW as well. Got released, bartered. There was a prisoner exchange, and he was released. And of course, during the rise of Nazism, he was smart enough to leave Germany. And he came to Boston. And eventually, through, I guess, his background, which was, while he was in Germany, he studied drawing and became an expert in Rembrandt drawings. And he became very interested in historical drawings from years ago, and he collected them. And his family came from art and antique background, and he, so he had always grown up and had interest in the arts, but his specialty was drawing. Long story short, he comes to the United States and to Boston, and eventually becomes the head drawing curator for the Fogg Museum, which is part of Harvard. And he becomes a faculty member at Harvard. So he's a thinking man. And, I enjoy this painting because I think I wouldn't put him in the same technical category as someone like Waldo Murray. But I look at this and I say, a very interesting story. And I don't know if that has anything to do with his past. And feel free to respond to any of this. If you see something that I don't.
What I see there is the generational, it looked like 3 or 4 generations of families there, family members.
It does, yeah.
I saw a painting somewhat similar to this by Edward Munch in the Museum of Modern Art about 9 years ago. And it struck me at the time that, it's really easy to do a still life of a sick person. And because everyone's so still around them. And it's a fascinating scene.
It is fascinating. It is.
Do you think that's the doctor at the head of the bed?
I believe it is.
So there's the working man.
Yeah, that's true. I guess that's one way to look at it. To me, with so many people and so much emotion.
Might be the mother, his mother.
Yes.
Wife or sister.
Right. And just, you look at Child here and everybody, I would assume that in 1936, people didn't immediately go to the hospital or to the emergency room when they weren't, they probably. Exactly. So that would be kind of what you would see. Of course, that's a while ago, so maybe none of us remember those days. 1936. Never know it. Okay, so let's see. That's tragedy, and I'll just read to you what I wrote here about him. He served in the German military, World War I. He was a prisoner of war. His family owned an art and antique business. He was exposed to European art, and this kind of looks like it could be European in the lights. If you compare it to that painting, which is much more ambient light, this seems to have a more direct and more contrast, which is more European in feel. I don't know, just saying. He also published a lot of books, and they became, part of the core of art history and understanding from an intellectual point of view. This deathbed scene possibly a doctor and family members. While perhaps an everyday scene of the time, it is in direct contrast to Murray work and could be a visual allegory. There are two other paintings by Rosenberg in this collection. Feel free to look around, see if you can find them. I think that would be kind of fun. Completely different in style. So to me, he was a painter, but he was probably a thinker and an art historian first in who he was as a person. So we're awfully close to around the corner. Let's just look at one of my favorite painters in this collection. And we can't get too close. Whoop. These two right here are Boston, Uptown and Downtown. They're by George Constantine. On the left, you can see they're signed and dated, and you can see that atmospherically they're very, very similar. What I found interesting as a comparative is across the way where we were previously is a still life by George Constantine that's highly colored and, you know, very strong palette, where these are very subdued and...
You're talking about the two left.
Yes, I am. So the name of those two is Uptown and Downtown Boston by the same artist, George Constantine. Now, what I found out about George, boy, I searched the internet, had a lot of trouble finding anything about him. I don't know if he changed his name to George Constant. I don't know. I suspect that he did. A lot of these people did kind of tweak their names a little bit. But basically, he also painted that scene. So we've got, not the one in the middle there, but the Esplanade concert. So again, that's a nice way to segue into understanding the work of one painter. So what I found about him was that he was born in Greece. He came here, he was a hardworking man. Let me see here. Uptown, I could find very little on him. He was born in Greece, eventually attending the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he was a member of the Boston Art Club. Oh, a few of them were. So my true detective hat tells me that that's the source of many of these paintings. So it's a wonderful example of that. And while we're here, one of my favorite ones is the pier. You will see, I think the name of it is the Fish Pier, and you can get closer to it later on, or wharf. But that also is just a beautiful, beautiful painting. Now, landscapes all season, perfect example over there. We have a winter one. Again, a local scene. Okay? So the last thing I really want to point out to you, and then I'm going to just let you enjoy these lovely paintings on your own. Let's see, the Christian Science is just back over there, so if we could go. I hate to do that to you. He doesn't care, okay? This is at the top of Waldo's. I should have pointed that out before, I suppose. Right up here. That's the Christian Science, yes, Christian Science Church.
In the 30s.
Yes, and that's what I love about it, is because here you have, the artist's name is J. DeGusto. I couldn't find a lot about him, I'm sorry, I tried. Internet gives you a lot of info, but I didn't really have enough time. But I will, I'm going to really pursue this because I love that painting. And what is so remarkable about it are the cars, because that's it. So it becomes, again, a wonderful example, 1936 social realism. And I'm sure...
You know what that square looked like in 1930s, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's not a photograph, it's not going to go away. It's a painting, it's very beautifully executed. Again, I don't know much about him, but anyway, I'm glad that you came. There's so many wonderful examples for you to explore. You want to know about this?
That one's different.
Okay, yeah. decorative. Okay, when I think 1936, and I think a feminine painter, and this is by, her name is Mildred Popelka. I tried to research her. She could have been married, I don't know, but I couldn't find anything under her name. Decorative, flat, almost an Asian influence, okay? It's one of my favorite pieces because it's just so lovely and just so beautifully done. The name of it is Debutantes. Very fitting.
Old 36, the film in the 30s. You know, the movie stars with the...
Yeah, I would say that would be, the palette is light, it's very decorative, very feminine, and I think it's beautiful. And probably my personal favorite, and again, it's a female artist, Maud Bernecker. Don't know, it's signed. Again, very decorative. You can see that is wallpaper in the background, which would be indicative of, I guess, those times, with the floral. This is a swan, which it took me a while to really understand that visually, but it is a swan.
I kept focusing on it, and I saw the neck.
Yeah, I know, it took a while. And to me, it, like this one, has a strong Asian influence. And I'm not sure what that's about, so I'm not going to pretend to know. But they're very flat and decorative, and the palette's very light, bright, and almost indistinguishable. You cannot tell really in this painting where the light is coming from, right? This one, not really either. They're not strong shadow or strong contrast. Okay.
The one up there, you definitely...
This one is just a gorgeous, gorgeous painting, and this is by H.A. Kuhn. And I was able to find a little bit about him, and I did find an example of one of his paintings online that was sold, and it looks very much like this one. That was his style. He did a lot of outdoor work in all seasons, and it is a beautiful, beautiful example.
Just for the sake of argument, how much would it sell for?
They're not, these aren't worth anything really to speak of. First of all, you're not supposed to sell them. And I don't know if people actually do or not. I know the posters, there was a whole part of the WPA was printing, obviously. Printing, okay, printing. They made copies and they made fabulous posters. If you ever want to really look at some very, very interesting artwork, just Google WPA posters. And they promoted the arts, they promoted, you know, working America. That was the whole idea. It was to raise the spirit of the everyday American and so on and so forth. So with that, I think I'm going to end and let you enjoy on your own these wonderful paintings. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.